I'm Lou Bank from Agave Road Trip. I was contacted by Sean Miller from Packaged. Sean wanted to put a series of ads together for Agave Road Trip, for the podcast that I host. But as we started talking, the idea grew, and what he wanted to do instead was a bunch of brand profiles of the spirits that they're bringing into the USA from Mexico. And I'm all down for that. I love telling the stories of the people and the places that are carrying on this multi-generational wisdom and really shepherding this cultural heritage that I find so frequently in rural Mexico. But to do that, of course, we had to go on an agave road trip. So Sean and I made a plan to visit his brands over a 3-day period back in June. And the result was this really amazing opportunity for me to remind myself of what it is that I know and what it is that I don't know about rural Mexico. We started our trip visiting El Pandillo. That's the distillery of Felipe Camarena, and that's just outside of Arandas, Jalisco. The brand that Packaged brings into the USA from Felipe is G4. It's kind of a famous brand, but, just because it's famous amongst tequila geeks does not mean that you know about it. Or even if you know about it, maybe you don't understand exactly why it's so delicious, and I certainly didn't. And that's why this visit to El Pandillo was so pivotal for me. What I got to see was obviously how Felipe cooks his agave. What I didn't realize was that he just lets it sit for 3 days in his steam ovens, his brick steam ovens, and then he collects what they call the bitter honey, the sweat, if you will, that comes off of the agaves in that oven, and then mixes it into the milled agave. The thing I found second most interesting about Felipe, his desire to experiment with all these different pieces of the method of making his tequila. And I think the result is, even though you've got the exact same agave being processed by the same guy in the same distillery, you get huge variations in flavor based on which of the water he uses, how much of the fibers left in the fermentation, all these different pieces that he's playing with. So that's the second most interesting thing I found about Felipe. The first most interesting thing I found about him was just how funny he is to hang out with. One of the things after this weekend I said very many times to Sean is that every one of the brand owners or distillers that he's working with is somebody I like to hang out with, that I want to travel with, and I'd love to spend more time with Felipe. During our visit, he shared with me a taste of a spirit that he's just starting to make, so I got to taste a sample of that, and it was delicious, and I asked if they had a bottle of that yet. And they didn't have enough to share yet, so instead they made a special, unique combination of G4 for me. So that was fun. But the most fun was as we were standing outside, he had to make it known to me that he was actually whiter than I was, and he pulled up his pant leg to show me how white his legs were. Now, I will say, once I pulled up my pant leg, he realized just how white I truly am. But in that moment, I got to see the fun, playful, vulnerable side of Felipe Camarena, which is really and truly a dear side. So that was the first day of our trip on the Thursday, and then on the Wednesday rather. Then on the Thursday, the next morning, we headed out to Taberna Tres Gallos. So that's out of Aguacatepec, Jalisco. And that's a project started by Alvaro Fernandez. He and his family have this really beautiful, huge old hacienda that they've converted into a bunch of homes and businesses. And the raicilla that he's making there is one of those businesses. It's the distillery, the Taberna, is run by Fausto Romero. And what they're doing is they're converting Maximiliana into this beautiful spirit using fairly traditional methods, right? So he's cooking above ground in a brick oven using steam. So very much in the same way that Felipe is cooking agave to make his tequila. So at Tres Gallos, to make their El Acabo, they're using a roller mill to mill their cooked agave. And then fermenting in some of it open air steel tanks, some of it closed steel tanks, and then distilling in wood-fired copper stills. One of the little side things they took us on, a trip they took us on when we visited Tres Gallos, was out to see both the wild and the farmed agave, and how they have the two different species of agave, both Angustifolia and Rhodocantha, how they've got them growing together out in their fields. And it was really a beautiful trip to take. And you got to see as well, just right next to those fields are wild plants. And the wild plants also include some wild agave. They don't use it to make spirits, but they also leave it on the land to keep some biodiversity near those fields. One thing I've never done in visiting any of these producers is to harvest the iuelos, right? So these are, in essence, the little offshoot babies, the clone babies of the mother plants of agave. And so they gave me the opportunity to do that, which I was grateful for. Just moving the iuelos from the mother plant, finding a place to replant them, nurturing those plants, that's just one difficult piece of the many difficult labors in making these beautiful spirits. We had a beautiful drink in those fields with Alvaro and his team, it was really a delightful moment. So then, one of my concerns whenever I see iuelos is that if you rely 100% on iuelos, you're going to end up with a monoculture eventually, genetically homogeneous monoculture. Replanting iuelos is not the only method they have of regenerating the fields at Tres Gallos. They also have a really robust greenhouse where they're germinating seeds from those agaves that they let go to full maturity. And it's a huge program of seedlings with just all of these beautiful little plants coming up that they then move out into the fields once they're strong enough to sustain themselves. I really like El Acabo, and I don't want you to hear these comments as overshadowing that beautiful raicilla. But I gotta say, one of the most fascinating, interesting things I've ever tasted, actually, in the world of agave spirits is asil. It's the wood-aged raicilla that they're making at Tres Gallos. And they left this spirit in the barrels for 2 years, and it's just come out this beautiful color that almost looks wrong. And I would say it almost looks wrong because so frequently when we're seeing añejos, or even extra añejos, those are coming from barrels that have been used for years and years and years. And so you don't get a lot of color off of that. And sometimes that color gets augmented by caramel coloring. What I tasted in asil, what I got to see in asil and taste in asil, was something that was just 100% wood, and wood that was really probably second or third generation used in these barrels based on the color. And the taste is absolutely exquisite. So, if you get a chance to taste asil, you should definitely do it, and definitely get a chance to taste El Acabo. We spent the evening in the tasting room at Tres Gallos, where I was interviewing Alvaro and Fausto. for an episode of Agave Roadshow, and Fausto was making cocktails with El Cabo, and normally I'm not a cocktail drinker, which maybe also means that the sugar in his cocktails got me a little bit tipsier than I am accustomed to, which I think is going to make for probably a better interview from me. But it was a really wonderful evening, and it really made me enjoy and appreciate cocktails in a different way. You know, I've got a natural prejudice against, and I recognize it, it's a prejudice against denominations of origin. They tend to exclude the families who have shepherded the cultural heritage of that spirit, and Raicilla is no different. One of the biggest things I got out of this trip was spending time with Alvaro. This is a guy who I want to travel with. This is a guy I really liked. This is a guy I want to visit time and again. And although I might not be a fan of the denomination of origin, A, it doesn't mean that I'm right, but B, I think it's important to reflect on the fact that Alvaro has a very specific view of how he can best preserve the cultural heritage of Raicilla. That was a huge thing that I got out of this trip. You know, it didn't change my view, but it did make me open to being friendly with the people who are organizing these denominations of origin. You know, that trip was capped off with a visit to Alvaro's brother's, what would you call it, queseria? The place where they're making cotija cheese. You know, I've been a vegan for a few years now. When Alvaro took us up to the attic of the queseria where they're making this beautiful cotija, they're aging this beautiful cotija. It was the smell of it. The smell of it was absolutely hypnotizing. And I had to buy a wheel of cotija. Now, I didn't taste that wheel, but I brought it to my friend Eduardo Angeles in Santa Catarina, Minas, Oaxaca. So the trip was capped off with a visit to Elvia Hito. This is a distillery that I visited first, I want to say 2 or 3 years ago, but it was only, I think, last year that I became friendly with the member of the family who's been running it for years. The distillery was founded in 1937. They had their own brand ages ago, but they stopped making it a couple decades ago, and they're just now bringing it back into the market. And Juan Eduardo Nunez is the current president of the distillery, and I got to meet him, and he was the first indication to me that I need to meet more of the distillers, more of the brand owners that Packaged is bringing in, because Juan Eduardo is just one of the sweetest, kindest people you could ever meet. He's the kind of person that I want to travel with. In fact, that was originally the plan, was we were going to bring Juan Eduardo around to other distilleries to get his sense of what they're doing. He's got such a robust history in his family of making tequila, and I wanted to see what his views of Raicilla were. But something came up that made it impossible for him to travel with us, so instead we connected with Juan Eduardo at Elvia Hito on the Friday. And it was a beautiful visit. We got to interview Juan Eduardo for Agave Roadshow, and of course we got to taste his spirits. You know, just as a wrap, my thoughts on this trip as a whole, it's very simple to suggest that all tequila is one thing and that all mezcal is one thing, and it's not. And I think visiting these families who make it helped me, certainly, and I think could help you to recognize that there are these traditions that are passed on from one generation to the next, and then played with even by the current generation, and they'll certainly be toyed with further by the next generation, to try and get results that speak to the palates of these families. And that's really what I'm looking for in these trips, is something that speaks to my palate, and looking for people who, in essence, are great chefs who know how to serve me a dish that I'm going to love. So I very much look forward to going back, and very much look forward to visiting even more of the Packaged brands in the future.